This screencast will examine the impact of World War II on the United States. When the nation entered World War II, it would bring an end to the Great Depression, of course, but also incite major social changes on the home front. What we'll do today is explore the various panics over sexuality that affected the wartime United States, examine some transformations in ideology, behavior, and experience, and get a kind of foretaste of how that would help make the post-war era a very different one. So when the U.S. entered World War II in late 1941, a sense of national crisis prevailed. There was a massive need for soldiers and, of course, for civilian workers as well. Those going overseas faced concerns about, will they come back? What kind of fighting will they see? And for those at home, there were other concerns, especially the geographical and labor mobility of the war years, which meant that families were separated, as millions of young men and hundreds of thousands of young women left their homes to work in the war effort, to fight, or to mobilize to labor in factories. And we can get a glimpse of some of these kinds of mobility, geographical, of course, but also labor-related, and also class mobility during the war years. This is the era when the term home front was first widely used. And the implications, of course, as the one on the right suggests, the poster, were that everybody had to be involved. You couldn't just sit this out. And so despite the war ending the Depression and ultimately ushering in a long-time economic boom, people at the time didn't know about this. And the war raised some of the same kinds of worries about family life and morality as did the Great War, and as did both the economic boom of the 1920s and the Depression of the 30s. So again, we'll look at a few areas of intense concern or panic, such as worry about venereal disease, about the behavior of women back on the home front, and about homosexuality inside and outside the military. The first step for most Americans who were going to fight was being inducted into the armed forces. And over 16 million men and women would serve in one capacity or another by the end of the war. There were massive efforts not just to persuade people to volunteer, and we'll look at a few relevant posters about this, but also, of course, a draft. And whether you were voluntary, joined on your own, or were conscripted, drafted, Americans who were inducted were weighed, measured, tested, and processed into the military. Once they're in it, we'll return to induction when we talk about homosexuality, but once they're in the military, what do they worry about? Venereal disease, or at least their superiors do. We saw back in the Great War, World War I, that the costs of venereal disease and the dangers of prostitution and easy women were a major focus. How was World War II alike, and how was it different? Well, the Comstock laws are still in effect, though they are ignored a lot more and sort of enforcement is piecemeal. But it is a different era. The pamphlet you were assigned for today is a bit more matter-of-fact than the material on VD from the Great War. There certainly is some continued focus on self-control, on what it means to be an adult and not give in to your urges. But overall, the tone is a bit more matter-of-fact. Why? Well, VD was certainly still expensive during World War II in terms of the cost of treatment and lost manpower, but the available treatments had in fact improved somewhat. And in World War II, the overall approach was less about invoking shame and guilt. You see a lot fewer warnings about making grandma cry. The focus in World War II is more about reminding men that VD was costly and unpleasant, but crucially, as these wartime posters suggest, the campaign also reminded soldiers and civilians that VD could be prevented and treated, and that is a very big difference. How did this happen? Through condoms. The poster on the left, of course, is equating venereal disease with the enemy. But the one on the right reminds us that it, just like them, displayed here in some pretty horrific caricatures, they could be beaten. Prophylaxis, the term used at the time, meant any sort of action to prevent disease or treat it. Prophylaxis could include treatment with sulfa drugs. That was the treatment of the time. It was a forerunner of antibiotics. or it might increasingly mean using government-issued condoms. And here on the right, using condoms is equated with fighting the enemy. It's what you're supposed to do. This pink document here, and I couldn't find a copy that had the full text on the top, reminds people that, as it says on the top right, venereal diseases can be prevented. You need to wear a rubber. It's much, much more blunt and direct and accurate than anything back in World War I. And this pink document, I don't know why they were pink, was a leaflet distributed in 1943. This one is from Fort Benning, Georgia. And again, it gives practical information. It listed the locations where military personnel could report for medical inspections, to receive treatment packs for VD, and again, to pick up condoms to prevent it. Here again, we see instructions on the left, and then on the bottom right, one of the kinds of kits that they handed out that told you how to treat yourself shortly after any feared exposure. So the military, unlike in the Great War, is making condoms and treatments for VD available. This ties into a big theme from D'Amelio and Friedman, the rise of sexual liberalism. So we see a growing acceptance, at least for male soldiers, that sex is not connected to marriage or to procreation, that it can be expected that young men will have sex, will seek it, and that there are ways of making sure it doesn't kill them or harm them for fighting. So that's true for men. What about for women? The nation was generally a lot more suspicious about the sexuality of women, straight or gay. And as the propaganda posters here show, women, even wives and mothers, were desperately needed to step into non-traditional roles during the war. But the kinds of appeals that were made to women tend to be somewhat different than those that were thought to work on men. On the left, in a poster I find really kind of creepy and horrifying, women are recruited to enlist with the Spars, which was the female division of the Coast Guard. And the invitation to them is not help your country or travel or be patriotic or earn a good living. It's you get to have a date with Uncle Sam. Yeah. On the right, we have, again, a beautiful, traditionally feminine woman who is shown mooning over letters from her soldier husband. And instead of being told, oh good, you're being properly womanly, she's admonished, longing won't bring him back, get a war job. Essentially, get off your butt and, jump in. So women are depicted as in familial roles, but as a way of encouraging them to leave the home, work, even again if they are involved, if they are married, even if they're mothers. The one in the center is much more straightforward. Here are the jobs that are available for you. But again, the one on the left and right show us the persistence of viewing women as partners and family members rather than as workers. This kind of ambivalence applied to female sexuality as well, where we see similar suspicion. As D'Amelio and Friedman described, there was great anxiety on the home front that although commercial prostitution was going way, way down in this period, and this is a development that had been building a long time, there was a great concern that there were lots of women who were basically volunteering for the job for free. The amateur, as depicted on the right, could be just as dangerous in terms of venereal disease as the prostitute. And so there's worry that not just bad girls, but respectable girls next door, maybe your daughter or your student, they were volunteering for the task of sleeping with soldiers. And in fact, a brand new vocabulary sprung up, terms that were used during the war for young women who were a little too enthusiastic about soldiers. They might be called victory girls. They might be called, if they were younger, khaki wackies, meaning young girls who just went nuts and lost their moral compass at the sight of a man in uniform. Think of it as teenagers running after boy band members. Again, the idea here is not that these are professional prostitutes, but that they accidentally cause all kinds of social havoc and spread disease because the restraints that held back previous generations have loosened. So there's less focus on commercial sex, but more concern about young women or girls, even that nice girl next door, corrupting or being corrupted by GIs. And again, women, as in the Great War, are seen as vectors of venereal disease infection. They are not given advice about here's where to get treated or here's how condoms work, please have some. Military men are given much greater room for access to sexual pleasure, while women's agency is still seen as really problematic and is potentially something that will kill you. And this relates, I think, to worries about women who are left at home becoming too independent and or acting out sexually in the absence of men in their lives. And these fears, I think, are going to help shape post-war developments that we'll get to next time. The last thing we're going to look at is the war's effects on same-sex sexuality, which are complicated. Now, the military screening of volunteers and draftees, especially men, but women as well, included assessments for signs of homosexuality. In theory, during the war, homosexuals were supposed to be screened out, not accepted for duty, when they showed up at induction centers. And the grounds for this were that gay men would make poor combat soldiers, their presence would threaten discipline and morale. And some of that argument lingers even today under very different circumstances. What this meant in the 1940s is that experts, psychologists, doctors, etc., would observe the bodies and mannerisms of men who showed up for the military and or gave them questionnaires along with IQ tests. Now remember, as D'Amelio and Friedman have written about at length, in the 1940s, homosexuality was largely thought of as a pathology that was closely associated with gender deviance, meaning that gay men were assumed to be effeminate, lesbians were assumed to be butch and tough, and evidence to the contrary kind of could render them invisible. So this meant that men who were interested in other men were likely to be seen in the 40s as having stereotypical female traits, and therefore, as you might guess, if a man volunteers or is drafted and is given a questionnaire and checks off that he likes soap operas better than baseball, or that he'd prefer to be a dancer rather than a fighter pilot, that's kind of suspicious. Experts also relied on inductees' responses to very simple questions like, so, do you like girls? We can imagine the amount of lying that went on, both by men who wanted to be in the military and those who were trying to avoid it. Now, as I've said, this was the official policy, to weed out likely male or female homosexuals, keep them out of the military to protect efficiency and bonding that were needed in a unit. In practice, though, this policy simply wasn't observed, especially as the war drew on and the need for fighting men was so dramatic. So in practice, historians who have looked at this argue that there was great pressure to meet quotas for having fighting men, and therefore a lot of the examinations were pretty perfunctory. There was a lot of, okay, you're telling me you like women, fine, I'm just going to pretend I believe you. So as a result, hundreds of thousands of homosexuals made their way into the armed forces. They served in all branches of the military: tank drivers, clerks, bombardiers, messmen, gunnery officers, you name it. And as we can see in these images here, in fact, in some areas, such as the theatrical troops who often put on performances for men who were stationed in remote areas, often far away from women, or at least from women who were deemed appropriate for them, gay men tended to be really relied on. Now, there were plenty of men who weren't gay, who cross-dressed and performed in drag shows. This was a very valued kind of group who brought real pleasure to the troops who came to see them. But many men who were openly gay, who performed in drag shows, gained great admiration and respect for their abilities. Combat essentially made drag okay. And so I would argue that the war years mean there are limited pockets where there's plenty of room for cross-dressing, and there are larger pockets where there is a great deal of toleration, acceptance, maybe not enthusiasm, but willingness to work with men who showed up to fight as long as they did their job well. As one gay Marine who fought at Iwo Jima later said in an interview, when asked, was he outed, was he, treated badly, He said, there was a war on. Who the hell was going